On behalf of the World Affairs Council and the Marines Memorial Association, I am Anya Manuel, your moderator for this evening, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Dr. Vali Nasr is currently the Dean of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, affectionately known as SAIS, as well as a Middle East scholar, author, foreign policy advisor, and active commentator on international relations. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. From 2009 to 2011, Dr. Nasr was special advisor to Dr. Holbrooke, the President's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Dr. Nasr has taught at many US universities, including Harvard's Kennedy School, the Fletcher School at Tufts, UC San Diego, and Stanford, among others. He has also written multiple books on US foreign policy. Please join me in welcoming Vali Nasr for a conversation about a small, very manageable topic, the challenges. He is going to ably cover the challenges and opportunities facing the Middle East, from Iran's nuclear ambitions to ISIS and the Syrian civil war and the remnants of the Arab Spring, how these events could impact international stability, and what the United States' role should be in shaping the future of the Middle East. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Nasr. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful being here. I'm very grateful to the World Affairs Council for inviting me here. I think, just in terms of setting the scene for our conversation, the Middle East is fraught with many challenges. If we went back 4 or 5 years to the early time of the Obama administration, the perception was that this region was in a fairly stable environment, that the best thing the United States could do was to wash its hands of the Middle East and pivot to Asia. And that actually became the mantra of the Obama administration. But the Middle East refused to be ignored. And actually, the more we try to ignore the Middle East, the more we encourage circumstances that makes it impossible for us to ignore the Middle East. So the Arab Spring, the events that promised change in the Arab world, change of government, perhaps democracy in some circumstances, maybe was interpreted by us as a good opportunity to install more stable political systems that it would actually facilitate America's ability to leave the region. Now, fast forward to today, the Arab Spring's legacy is actually a number of failed states in the region. So, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen are essentially in a free fall for the most part. And we have a number of other governments, regimes in the region, states that are in danger of a greater crisis. Lebanon, Jordan, for instance, come to mind. So, the legacy of the change is actually greater instability rather than stability. And the United States made a conscious decision to very quickly withdraw from Iraq, which actually put the deal that was put on the table by the United States in 2006, 2007, a power-sharing deal between Shiites and Sunnis and the Kurds, to largely become undone. I think actually it was a too rapid and a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq that caused the political deal that relied on U.S. presence and U.S. guarantee to fall apart. And the U.S. also made a very conscious decision not to get involved either in post-conflict reconstruction in Libya or in the civil war in Syria, largely making an argument that these don't really rise to the level of national interest that would require our engagement, and secondly, that the American public is tired of foreign engagements in the Middle East, and that these things would probably sort themselves out. Well, they sorted themselves out in the form of ISIS, which, given the very low threshold of tolerance Americans have for terrorism, meant that we would have to at least try to re-engage with the region. Now, ISIS, I think, is a is a much bigger deal than we actually make it out to be, or we understand that it is. We understand it as a terrorism threat, or as a vicious organization that does ridiculous and horrendous things, in our opinion. But the bigger challenge of ISIS is actually political. This is a movement that has traction with a certain segment of the Sunni Arab world, largely because its display of power is very attractive. Its methods may not be, its tactics are not, but it's seen as a movement that essentially has been able to conquer territory. For the first time since World War I, it has actually redrawn the map of the Middle East, breaking apart two of the most important Arab countries and carving a territory in there. It has proven itself very capable in the battlefield so far, and it has managed to reverse American policy on the Middle East. So we can say all we want, but ISIS has forced the US to re-engage in Iraq, to actually pay attention to the Middle East, and ISIS has managed to turn itself into America's single most important foe. And those are, in the minds of many, accomplishments that secular governments in the Middle East could not take credit for. And so there is a certain attraction there. The redrawing of the map of the Middle East is actually fairly important. Unless that's reversed, it could mean that other countries in the region could also be vulnerable to a major sort of realignment in the region. For now, we have a containment strategy with ISIS, but going forward, ultimately, it would force the next president in the United States to make a critical decision about what the US will do with this force and what's the degree of our commitment to actually dismantling and destroying ISIS. And then the more important thing is that after ISIS, there will be another ISIS, unless there is a commitment to state building, the kinds of things that we forswore that we will never do in the region. But without stable governments in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, you're going to have a recurrence of ISIS. Now, so overall, I think the scenario in the Arab world is fairly bleak. And I think it's a challenge for US foreign policy because for a long time we've been in the habit that our policy in the region should be based in the Arab world. All of our allies in the region were Arab rulers. We thought that the Arab world was stable enough internally to serve as a basis for US policy. That's no longer the case. And that really brings the question to the current nuclear negotiations with Iran. So the Iranians are, in some ways, have emerged, if you would, by default as, I don't want to call it winners, but as defying predictions that they would be the main victims of Arab Spring, and then they would be the main victims of the mess in the Arab world. That hasn't happened. So when you first had the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, the prediction was that there would be an uprising in Iran. That hasn't happened. But the Arab world instead has collapsed rather than becoming stronger, and Iran actually has increased its power in the Arab world. So, I think it is correct to say that Iran's influence in 4 capitals in the Arab world is now paramount, in Damascus, Beirut, Baghdad, and Sana'a in Yemen. Now, we can quibble about all of this, how strong that is, that's meaningful, but most of the Arab world actually believes that this is a non-Arab country that is actually bolstering and supporting and wielding influence in critical Arab countries. It is the main fighting force against ISIS. So on the ground, the most of the fighting, as it happened in the city of Tikrit a few days ago, was done by Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Shia militias. By all accounts, Iraqi security forces were fairly absent. So every defeat on the ground that ISIS has suffered, it has suffered at the hands of Iranian forces and Iranian-backed forces. So they're actually in a fairly solid position. And I think the very fact of negotiations between U.S. and Iran, and we can talk about, the dynamics of those talks, is also a game changer in the Middle East, because the structure of this region for over 3 decades was that Iran would be sitting outside, and there would be a coalition of American and Arab states that would basically be containing Iran. Now, the U.S. has decided that it's not committed to containment the way it was committed to it before, and that it's open to arriving at at least a stable arrangement with Iran, provided that they can have an agreement around the nuclear issue. For the Arab governments, which are already in a vulnerable position, that are afraid of their own publics, that are looking at ISIS and are looking at Iranian influence, this is not really good news. And ultimately, unless you see a scenario of going back to the way things were, something fundamentally has shifted in the Middle East with Iran. So that actually means that where we go with Iran in the next 2-3 months and then beyond that is perhaps equally important as what happens on the ground in the Middle East. Anyways, maybe I'll stop here and then we can carry these threads forward.
Thank you. That's a great initial overview of a very complex problem. Let me dig in a little bit on the issue of Iran, which in a way has become a linchpin, especially right now. A lot of U.S. diplomats focusing their entire efforts on this. And you said in a very thoughtful piece recently that, in a way that you echoed now, that instead of just relying on the Sunni Arab regimes, we need to have open communications with both Sunnis and Shias in the Middle East. Completely understandable, and I think a right point. Let me ask you 2 questions related to that. On Iran, some aspects of the possible nuclear deal have leaked in the press. There has been a massive amount of grandstanding by our Congress and by the Israelis. A lot of people saying the deal is just not good enough. So question 1 to you is, and I'll go into my second question, then maybe you can take them both together, is this deal, as what you've heard about it, good enough, and should the U.S. do it? 1. 2, at the same time, Iran has, just as you said, massively increased its influence in the Middle East. Just as you said, it's been a major fighting force on the ground in Iraq, helping to retake Tikrit. It has also been a major supplier of arms and a fighting force in Syria in support of President Assad. In the first case, we're aligned with Iran. In the second case, we're really not. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with this complicated, at least triangular problem of Iran? What do you think, if you were Secretary of State Kerry, what would you do at this point?
I'm just happy I'm not.
Makes you feel sorry for him, doesn't it?
But let me start at the other side. So one of the issues when you go around the Middle East and you talk to the Arab regimes that really bothers them is that the way things have unfolded in Syria actually has begun to sort of shift things in the direction of Iran. So yesterday, Secretary of State Kerry said that we would have to negotiate with Assad about the future of Syria. If you went back 2 years, we said we will never, ever talk to Assad, and Assad has to be gone yesterday. So that shift already suggests that Iranian policy succeeded, in the sense that Iran insisted at the beginning that Assad is not going to leave. And by the fact that Assad is still standing, so we're facing 2 choices. Either we have to increase our engagement in Syria, or we basically have to find a way to end the fighting. And find a way to end the fighting, now the Iranians have made it impossible to do that without Assad. So at some point, I think the next level everybody's afraid in the region is that we increasingly we end up in the same place with Assad that we are with the Iraqi government in Iraq. So we can't openly endorse Assad, but we will basically have a don't ask, don't tell policy with Assad and Iran. So let Assad and the Iranians crush ISIS. We won't condone it, but we won't object to it as well. And you could see that actually tensions between US and Turkey and US and Saudi Arabia and US and Qatar and US and the Arab governments has increased because it's very clear that they're still committed to the fact that Assad has to leave, but they don't see the same commitment in us.
Right.
Now, that's not because Iran has wooed us, but that's because the logic, if you thought about it, the logic of we don't want to get involved in the Middle East, and yet there is a problem in the Middle East that needs to be taken care of. How do you sort of square that circle? I mean, you either have to go in yourself, which was the way we thought about these issues when we went into Afghanistan and we went to Iraq, or you basically say we don't want to go in, so then who's going to be fighting ISIS? And without declaring it publicly, the Iranians have stood up and raised their hand. And so in Iraq, they're actually doing it. In Syria, what they're telling everybody in the international community is we're going to back Assad, let Assad crush these, which actually was the Russian argument from day one, that, you know, you're not going to go in, we're not going to go in. The only force fighting ISIS is Assad. And the other argument that they make is that Assad may be horrendous, but it's ISIS that you're focused on. And so you have to find solutions for ISIS. So that actually really puts a big problem on the table for US foreign policy. So, you know, in a de facto way, we're beginning to rely on Iran, although we don't want to claim it. So in Iraq, we're letting them do the fighting, but we're letting them do the fighting because we don't want to do the fighting. So if you don't want to do the fighting, then in a de facto way, you allow the Iranians to do the fighting. Now, whether Iran has the capacity to do this remains to be seen, whether they can actually carry wars in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria at the same time. But right now, that's their power play. They're basically saying they're dealing with an America that doesn't want to get engaged in the Middle East, and they're basically playing to that reluctance, if you were to say. Now, the deal with Iran, it's always going to be a subjective deal. Every deal, by definition, involves a compromise. And there are two areas that the compromise happens. One is on Iran's nuclear capacity. The second is on what Iran wants, which is sanctions. So, you know, I think the shape of the deal that will come about is a 10 to 15-year deal, which is always going to be an interim deal. So you can take the existing interim deal and stretch it from 1 year to 10 years. So for 10 years, Iran agrees to stop doing certain things, to be verified, in exchange for which it will demand certain things in terms of sanctions relief and unfreezing of their assets. You know, where the United States started, which was zero enrichment, so we've already compromised on that. So any deal ultimately will involve recognizing Iran's enrichment and reprocessing capacity. It's a matter of how many centrifuges. So that's always going to be seen as a big concession by the US. And on this side, what is it that you give Iran is also going to be open to debate. On the other side, I think the Iranians also have the same problem. What is a good deal in Iran? So can the Iranian president actually take this to the bank in election day? I mean, can he really say that I didn't sell out the country's sort of nuclear program and the billions of dollars that is put into it for nothing? Or can he actually go back to Iran as a national hero, having sort of opened up Iran to many possibilities? So I think on both sides there's going to be this subjectivity. I actually think technically they are in agreement. I think where the problem lies is that it's going to be really difficult selling this deal in both capitals. And that's why they're negotiating about maximal things on both sides. I think there's a good chance a deal would happen, but I think it's also possible that it will fall apart. I actually think Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Republican Congress now have put the US president in a position that he has to get a deal. Because if there's no deal, it could be seen that he's capitulating to their pressure. So in an ironic way, they have forced the president to own the deal now. It's his deal because they've gone after him very directly. So I think he's more motivated to get to a deal. But whether it's possible, it still remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. That's a great overview. Thank you. Let me press you just a little bit on Iran as a regional actor, because I think while the nuclear deal is covered a lot in the US press, all of the different ways in which Iran inserts itself in different countries in the region isn't completely understood, and the Shia-Sunni split and how complex that is within each of the Middle Eastern countries, and in Saudi Arabia, which has a substantial Shia minority, that's not completely understood. So you gave this excellent overview of what Iran is doing, and you seem to be saying that it's winning the fight for regional influence. So do you think America is making a strategic mistake by not being more engaged in Syria, A, and in the fight against ISIS, B?
Well, if we wanted to have influence in the Arab world, you can't have influence by being absent. I mean, I hear this in the region. They say, well, if you've decided you're going to go to Asia and you're not going to be here, then basically we're going to factor you out. You can't have it both ways. You can't just show up and say, everybody rally together and follow my lead, and we want you to do X, Y, and Z, go bomb Iraq, go bomb Syria, and then we're going to leave. So you're not going to get, there's no longer trust in American policy in the region. I mean, we've communicated very loud and clear to them for 3-4 years that we really don't want to have anything to do with you, and our future lies in Asia, and we're gone. And I think that takes a lot of repairing to do. I remember one time in the Arab countries, a minister who was from a country who was very engaged in Syria and is very anti-Assad. He said the lesson of Syria to us is that Russia stands by its friends and the U.S. doesn't. I mean, it was comparing Egypt and Syria. So, you abandoned Mubarak the minute the wind began blowing in a different direction. Well, look at these guys. They don't care about what international public opinion says about them, how much you want to shame Putin and the Iranian government. They're going to stick by their friends. And in this region, that really matters. So I do think that. I do think that, we are paying, and we will pay for the strategic decision we made. But, we're reluctant. We also don't want to leave completely either. And I think that's going to hurt the U.S. With Iranians, I think the difference between Iran's foreign policy today and, say, under the Shah's regime was the Shah basically didn't want to have anything to do with the Arab world. He didn't want influence there. He just didn't want any trouble from their coming to Iran. Whereas the Islamic Republic is really interested in the Arab world for varieties of reasons. So it actually craves influence in the Arab world. Some in Iran crave it, I would say, in an offensive, hegemonic way, and there are those in Iran who crave it in a defensive way, in the sense that ultimately attack on Iran will come from the Arabs. And forward defense in Iran means you control them. So Iraq invaded Iran. 1 million Iranians, by many estimates, died. They occupied a part of Iran. They wanted to annex it. And so the Iranians say that the only way that Iraq is not going to invade Iran again is if you control Baghdad. And now we've got Baghdad, we don't want to rule over them. We just, are going to Finlandize Iraq in that sense. So, and I think Iran's geostrategy is based on two things. Iran has probably, it has the lowest expenditure on military of most of its neighbors as a portion of its GNP, compared to Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE as a percentage of its income. And then technologically, those countries have access to much more superior weaponry than Iran. So Iranians have decided that actually it's, what we call asymmetric forces, which means militias and guerrilla fighters, are a more optimal military mechanism for them to use. For instance, they look at Hamas and Hezbollah as a forward defense against Israel. So keep Israel busy on its own borders, so it's not busy on your borders. And I think the nuclear program provides a perfect umbrella for this sort of strategic activity. So, Iranians don't have an air force. Their air force belongs in a museum. It goes back 30, 40 years. And if you looked at it, we don't know what their capability is in tank warfare or artillery these days. So their capability is basically militia warfare, asymmetric warfare, and then, a nuclear umbrella on top of it. They do see the Shias in the region as their natural allies, largely because the Shias in the Arab world are alienated by Sunnis. So they look to Iran as their allies. So, take the case of Yemen. So the Houthis in Yemen may not be sort of complete clients of Iran, but the Houthis are surrounded by Sunnis who hate them and will destroy them, and there's one country in the region that's going to give them support. So they automatically become natural allies of Iran. So the Shia-Sunni problem in the Arab world is really part of a dysfunction of Arab political system, in the sense that there's no unified definition of identity in these countries, and that plays to Iran's advantage. But the Iranians at the same time don't want to be seen as a Shia power. They still want influence with the Sunnis, and that's why anti-Israeli policy is beneficial to them, because it creates, first of all, Iranians are positioning themselves as more Arab than the Arabs on Israel. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the Israel issue is the secular Muslim issue, right? So it allows you to have a lot of influence among the Arab world because you basically are advocating their cause against Israel. So there is difficulty. Iran can't rule over the Arab world, but it definitely wants to have influence over there. And right now it sees a vacuum in the region that allows it much more room to maneuver.
Thank you. That's great. And let me ask you one more piece on the Iran deal, and that is, as you rightfully said, the president has now essentially been backed in a corner where he has to do a deal. When that deal comes out and is public, there is going to be a huge, unfortunately, likely very public food fight in the US over it. How do you think, what's your best prediction of how that will play out, and how do you hope it plays out?
Well, I think it really comes down to how strongly the president wants to stand up for a deal and how comfortable he feels standing up for a deal. But the reality is that the food fight will not impact just the Iran deal. It will impact every deal that the United States is going to enter to with any foreign power. So, if Congress basically uses the Iran deal to arrogate many more authority and basically says that the president cannot enter into any agreement without congressional authority, then that actually can undermine many other negotiations and discussions that any U.S. president could have with any foreign leader. It will have a broader impact. I think that's very key. The second is that it already has started to impact the Iranian negotiations. So if you're sitting in Iran, you begin to wonder, really, are you entering into a deal that may have no more legs than just 2 years? And you might have a new American president coming in and basically saying, I'm not bound by this deal anymore. So I'm sure that now in Geneva, they're asking for more ironclad guarantees from the U.S. delegation than they were asking 6 months ago, and I think that impacts the dynamics of the negotiations. So I think the president is put in a position of saying, if there is a deal, it really would require enormous amount of effort on his part to convince the American public to support it and really to go to bat against Congress now, or that he would say, well, this is not worth the effort, and we're not going to succeed, so might as well not sign it. And that's always the danger that might happen. I think the Iranians are also gauging the same thing. What is the commitment here?
Thank you. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I want to move to those. And one last question on this issue, because it was funny and it came from the audience member, who says, if you met Senator Tom Cotton tonight, what would you say to him?
Well, I think the broader issue, the broader signal is this, and it's not just a signal to the Iranians. It's actually really, it's a statement about the direction of American foreign policy. Because any world leader, the Iranians included, could ask, well, if Congress takes that position, and if President Obama is not able to push that back, then maybe we shouldn't be negotiating with an American president, we should just negotiate with Congress. Basically, it is a major statement about American foreign policy that goes beyond Iran.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Let me move on to the topic of Israel. And there were a number of questions from the audience about the upcoming election. Is Netanyahu going to survive? Is he not? And if he doesn't, will that have a big impact on the Middle East?
Well, there's now start of a murmur that maybe he won't win. I think if he doesn't win, it's going to be seen more as a statement about U.S.-Israeli relations than it is about Israel and the Middle East. It all depends on who becomes Israel's prime minister. There are candidates within the Likud party who are to the right of Netanyahu, or on the right, and that obviously would make things much more tense. And then you might have Labor or more centrist or left takes over, and that will make for a very different dynamic. But there's no doubt that Prime Minister Netanyahu has emphasized Iran as the center piece of Israel's geostrategic concern. There are others who think that the Palestinian issue, for instance, remains the most important vexing foreign policy security issue for Israel to address. So there might be a shift in position in Israel, not to say that there's going to be a change on Iran, but maybe the degree to which Israel has taken a position on this issue might shift going forward. But I don't think, it really doesn't change the larger issues, which is the stalemate between Arabs and Israelis over land, over settlement, or the larger stalemate between Iran and Israel over the nuclear issue. I mean, these things are not going to fundamentally change with a change of government in Israel. I think those are harder questions. They really go to the heart of Israel's geostrategic conception, so they will continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And moving around the region with lots of leadership changes and possible instability, Saudi Arabia has recently had a change of leader. By all accounts, the new crown prince is old. He is feeble. No one knows how long he will live. At some point, Saudi Arabia will have to move to a new generation of princes, and it is not entirely certain which one of those princes will work out. In the meantime, Saudi Arabia is struggling with its own minority issues, with a populace that is increasingly dissatisfied with the deal they're getting from their government. How do you see that playing into the regional dynamic? First, what do you think will happen internally, and then how do you think it affects the regional dynamic?
Well, first of all, King Abdullah had very strong positions on a number of regional issues. For instance, on Iraq and on Syria, and there might be some movement there now that you have a different king in Saudi Arabia. Anytime you have a succession crisis, you also have a period of inward-looking consolidation of power, and so there's a sort of a movement of pieces on a chessboard, and new people in new positions, and so some of that will also consume Saudi attention for a period. There is an important issue of the drop in oil prices. We often don't think that impacts Saudi Arabia, but it does. I mean, end of the day, International Monetary Fund's estimate is that Saudi Arabia needs $90 a barrel to balance its budget. They obviously have vast reserves, and they have a great deal of borrowing capacity and all of that, but it means that right now the oil revenue is below what Saudi Arabia needs for meeting its obligations. So, if oil prices remain low for a long period of time, say beyond two years, then you might begin to have some impact in Saudi Arabia. Say if you had to cut certain spending, it impacts somebody. If you change your foreign aid, it will impact somebody. So the drop in the oil prices is important going forward. The succession issue is still on the table, although there is a hint about where the next generation may go. The crown prince, as they say, to the crown prince, Prince Mohammed bin Naif, comes from a second generation. If he retains that position, then you have an indication as to which branch of the family will become the de facto new royal family, in a sense. But then there's a lot of negotiation would have to go with other power holders within the royal family that will be instrumental going forward. But I think the three big strategic issues for Saudi Arabia are the following: is American shale oil. So the single biggest threat to Saudi Arabia is the United States in that sense. So if, and again, yesterday there was reports that American shale oil is not slowing down as had been expected. So, and the Saudis understand the threat of shale oil, because once it begins to occupy large parts of the market, it impacts fundamentally their most important strategic commodity, which is not just economic. Saudi Arabia's global power also rests on its importance to oil markets. So even if they earn money but were not as important as before, it has an impact. The second big significant strategic issue for them is Iran, because it's been the rival in the region. As I said, Saudi Arabia sees that its main backer, the United States, has lost its interest in the region. They see Iranians, gaining in influence, and they're worried that the U.S. and Iran are talking. Even a subtle shift there has big impact for Saudi Arabia going forward. And the third issue is really ISIS and Islamic radicalism. The Saudi population, much like the Egyptian population, Jordanian population, is vulnerable to this. By some estimates, there are some 20,000 Saudis fighting in Syria. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There is sympathy for them. During the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia had to commit itself to a much larger entitlement program in order to pacify the opposition. And the Saudis took a very hard line against Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, because they thought that Muslim Brotherhood could influence their population. So the dynamic of ideology and political mood on the street is not favorable to Saudi Arabia. We're right now paying not much attention to that. We're focused either on the terrorism fight or on the rulers. But they are very aware that Arab Spring was only 2-3 years ago, and the fundamental issues that caused the Arab Spring have not gone away, and also this ideology of ISIS, or the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood is attractive to a generation of young people in Saudi Arabia, and that's the real third major strategic vulnerability they have.
Thank you. It's a very complicated web of things, and as you said, in one way, in Syria, there has been almost a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and some of the other Sunni Arab kingdoms in terms of delivering arms and even fighters on the ground. So moving now to Syria, we've touched on it in the regional context, but we haven't talked about the massive refugee problem that's going on there. So you have over 200,000 killed, several million refugees that are destabilizing other countries in the region because they're fleeing across the borders. What would you say about that problem? Is there more that the U.S. can do about it? And in general, do you see a solution?
Well, it's a very good question, because we usually think of refugees as sort of an afterthought to the strategic issues we're dealing with. So at least a third of Syria's 21 million population has been displaced. And that's a really huge number. And it has, you can think about what it means for 7 million people to be homeless, to be without a proper economy, for their children basically to be left to their own devices in refugee camps. A recent number was that the number of Syrian kids that need schooling in refugee camps is equivalent to the entire population of the state of Maryland. That's the size of and if you don't give them education, you're just basically growing a generation of displaced, alienated, uneducated youth with no hope in the future. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to know what direction they might be moving and what it means for the region. But also, Syria's refugee problem is destabilizing to the rest of the region. So About a size of the Syrian refugees in Jordan is now equivalent to 25% of Jordan's population. In fact, the largest refugee camp in Jordan would be that country's fourth largest city in just terms of the size of that refugee camp. In Lebanon, the number of refugees that have gone there, who tend to be all Sunni, is actually changing the sectarian balance in Lebanon, which could, cause a conflagration over there. Now, the international community is not doing much about the refugees, basically. What the assistance that's coming is fairly paltry compared to what is needed. But what is actually needed most of all is a ceasefire in Syria. Refugees won't go back, can't go back until, first of all, the fighting stops, and also areas that is under the control of either Al-Qaeda forces or ISIS is cleared out. Then the question becomes, how do you get to a ceasefire, right? So actually that needs some kind of a political process equivalent to what was in the Balkans or in other conflicts, which currently doesn't exist really. And secondly, who's going to clear out ISIS out of these areas so people can go back? And then, Syria is not a rich country, and large parts of this country has been completely devastated. People compare Syrian cities in the way they look to European cities after World War II. So, there was a Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, and that's an open question too about who's going to be paying for rebuilding of Syria going forward. But the problem is there is no Syria policy. There is no Syria strategy. It actually doesn't exist. If you actually asked, and many people in the region do, so what is the strategy for Syria? And the simple answer is that there isn't one.
There is, however, an ISIS strategy, which is currently evolving. There have been a lot of news reports about new Obama administration pronouncements on that. And let me actually say, we've focused a lot on U.S. policy because we're sitting here. But when you look at the Syrian civil war, the United States wasn't able and willing to really intervene in a way that would have turned the tide, that would have kicked Assad out. The Europeans and the rest of the international community wasn't either. And when you see this vacuum of the Western democracies in a space, you see there is no such thing as a policy vacuum. Other actors, just like you said, have moved in and filled that vacuum. So we've talked about Syria internally, and you don't really see a problem. You don't really see a solution to that difficult problem. When you look at ISIS and how we're approaching ISIS, do you think we are on the right path?
Well, we're on the right path in terms of just containing the problem and actually maybe sort of degrading it a bit. But the ironic part of it is that our strategy actually is, I believe, is reliant on Iran doing all the job, all the work, because in the end the fighting on the ground is happening by Shia militias and Revolutionary Guards. So, and in Syria basically there is no alternate strategy other than the Assad government. So in reality, it is not a serious ISIS strategy. I think what would we require more seriously, there has to be a ceasefire strategy for Syria. There has to be a serious military strategy that the U.S. has to show willingness to commit to this fight, and only then would Europeans and other Arab governments get involved. And then thirdly, there has to be a strategy about what happens afterwards to Syria and Iraq. What is our strategy for making these countries whole? None of that really exists. So in reality, we're sort of dealing with the worst of ISIS up front. But I just don't think, I think it's kicking the can down the road, but at some point we'll have to own up to it.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions, understandably, on ISIS from the audience, so I'll try to condense them into a few. But one that came up several times is, what exactly is the goal of ISIS? Is it territory? Is it power? Is it money? And why are people so attracted to it? Especially, why are women attracted to it?
Well, I mean, you know, they're very interesting sort of scenarios. I mean, in sort of Pakistani Kashmiri families in England, some studies have shown that, you know, because girls are basically forced to marry somebody who's been chosen for them, choosing your own jihadi to marry is a liberating idea for a teenager. They're making at least their own decisions, basically, rather than having to follow their parents' mandate. But you know,
Feminism, ISIS style.
why ISIS appeals to tribes in Mosul or did at one point to tribes in Mosul or parts of Syria, and why does it appeal to European youth is very different. In Europe, you know, there is a problem of alienation among young people who neither identify with the original country where their parents or grandparents came from, and nor do they are integrated in the country that they're in. For instance, the two attackers on Charlie Hebdo newspaper didn't speak Arabic. They didn't know much about Islam as youth. Were born in France. They had no identification with Algeria and its culture, but they're also not French by any stretch of imagination. So, you know, something like ISIS or Al-Qaeda is appealing to them because it integrates them into the community and also empowers them. ISIS's show of force is appealing to Muslims, and particularly Arabs, who feel that they've lost in every single battle. Their governments may be popular in Washington, but they really don't deliver. They don't deliver on the battlefield. They don't deliver at the diplomatic table. They don't deliver on socioeconomic issues. So, you know, there is an appeal on ISIS until actually ISIS rules over them. Then, you know, the appeal can very, very quickly become stale. Now, you know, ISIS at some level is, yes, it has an ideological dogma and very radical views of Islam, but it is a political force. It's a military force on the ground. It's conquering territory, it's building an economy, it's building a government, it's ruling over territory by terror as well as alliances and other methods. It has a strategy, it has an administrative structure, it has a tax collection system. It's basically building all of these. And, you know, we've seen vicious radical groups like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or the Viet Cong, who might be ideologically extremely radical, but ultimately these are political movements. I would say the way to think about ISIS is a state in formation. I mean, basically, that's what's happening on the ground, that it's building political structures and it's consolidating authority over a vast territory. And the ideology is there. That's the guiding sort of principle. But in essence, it's essentially you're dealing with a political military force.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. When my students at Stanford ask about it, I explain it with looking at the Taliban in 1995.
Absolutely.
When you have a civil war, you have essential anarchy, and any rule is better than no rule. And
well, that's definitely, absolutely, that's definitely there, but also movements like this, and it used to exist in European history, essentially, you know, these kind of armies on the move basically end up creating states. You know, most of the states in the Middle East were created by colonial powers. These are sort of forces from below. And, you know, when talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda, it's very important to separate what generals think and what foot soldiers think. And these are not always the same things. So, you know, you can always recruit a young person, idealistic, on the promise of varieties of things, to go fight for you. And they might be true believers, but that doesn't mean that, you know, their bosses and their generals don't have a much more sinister political view of things. That's true of every sort of military force as well. And I think it's true of ISIS too. And I think ISIS is very strategic. Even its use of barbarity and terror is very effective because it terrorizes the population against uprising against ISIS. It also terrorizes military forces that want to go fight ISIS. I mean, when you burn a soldier alive, I think every government around the region doesn't want to have a soldier captured by ISIS, and every soldier in the region understood that they don't want to be captured by ISIS. And that has a power, if you would, of deterrence. I mean, if you're a small force of I don't know how many fighters there are ISIS, 30,000 fighters, and you're holding a territory from the borders of Turkey literally to southern Iraq, you don't have the manpower for effective control. So terror is very important in getting compliance and deterring action against you.
Thank you. We've touched on the issue of U.S. military presence in the Middle East at numerous points in the conversation. But there are several questions on it, so I wanted to kind of bring it to a point. You said earlier that you think the withdrawal from Iraq in 2011 was perhaps premature. It would have been good to keep a small U.S. force in there. What do you think that a U.S. military presence, and now we are back with just about 3,000 folks, do you believe that a U.S. military presence could resolve some of these conflicts? Could it build multi-ethnic, multi-religious states in the Middle East, or is this basically a quixotic quest that's never going to succeed?
Well, you know, the problem with Iraq is that we never sort of acknowledged what we were doing. We put a lot of emphasis on the surge, that the surge was just a military operation. But in reality, the surge had a number of values. First of all, by securing Baghdad, General Petraeus convinced the Sunnis they're not going to capture it again, right? So at some points, the fighting for restoring Sunni rule in Iraq is done. And in fact, one of the things that the surge did, it created an orderly transition of neighborhoods between Shia and Sunni. And when that was done, there really was nothing more to fight over. And then the presence of U.S. forces gave guarantees to Sunnis, basically that we're here, we protect the calm, and gave certain guarantees to Shiites. The surge allowed negotiations over power sharing. We never sort of went out and said that's what we're doing, but the two sides agreed to a deal that was then protected by U.S. military presence. I mean, if you look at most other post-conflict events, we're still in Germany, we're still in Korea, but we left Iraq to zero. And if we had left Germany as quickly as we left Iraq, maybe Germany may have fallen apart. If we'd left Korea that quickly, you know, something would have happened. So, you know, we stayed long enough so that the political deal that we negotiated would grow roots. I mean, if you looked at Bosnia, we're still in Bosnia. Actually, we took our troops out, the Europeans went in, but the NATO force that initially was the guarantor of the Dayton Agreement is still there. And the Dayton Agreement now between, I don't know, when was it,
95.
95, now it's almost 20 years old. So we stayed 20 years to make sure that that deal will hold. And even today, people say if NATO completely moved out of Bosnia, you know, it could go back to some sort of a conflict. I'm not at all surprised that the Shiites and Sunnis fell on one another right away. I mean, obviously, we blame it on them. Of course, they're incomplete. Of course, they're not perfect. But the whole reason we were there and needed to negotiate this deal it was exactly because they are imperfect, because they were sectarian, because they had no history of living together. So I think, you know, Iraq could have come out better than it did, and once we left it, and I think when Syria went into civil war, I don't believe Iraq had any chance of survival with what was happening in Syria. So maybe we should, I mean, this is a different question whether we should have ever gone to Iraq. I don't want to open that can of worms, but the fact of it is that that's a different issue. You look at the reality of where you are, and where we were is that we created certain stability, and then we basically took our hands off of it, and then it basically very quickly began to disintegrate.
Mm-hmm. And I think in Afghanistan, we just announced that we're staying a little bit longer, and so I think partly we're learning from the lessons of Iraq that maybe we do not need to rush for the exits in Afghanistan. And
I also think that if there had been 30, 40, 50,000 American troops on the ground in Iraq, Assad would have calculated the game in Syria very differently. Mm-hmm. You know, once you're gone from a region, people know you're not going to come back, mm-hmm. because the cost of, you know, returning is so huge that you know, it allows them much more room, basically maneuverability. We really had no effective way of influencing the Syrian civil war early on, where we could have, without having that sort of at least display of potential power in Iraq.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to look at two other big strategic players in the region, and those are Egypt and Turkey. In Egypt, there was this beautiful moment of hope in 2011. We all followed the events in Tahrir Square. Very quickly, you got a Muslim Brotherhood government, and now it looks like you have a government that looks pretty close to Mubarak and the ones that came before them. How do you see that playing out? And what, if anything, do you think the United States, could have done to have a more democratic outcome, if anything, and what can we do now?
Well, I don't think we had tremendous amount of levers to help a democratic outcome earlier. I actually think it would have been better for Egypt if Mubarak had had a slower exit, so that actually there would have been possibility maybe for some more democratic liberal forces to have consolidated. I think a situation where the choice was between Mubarak or the Muslim Brotherhood was not necessarily one that would have had a good outcome. So, Egypt is trying to go back to the Mubarak era, but there are difficulties. One is the economy is not where it was. So after the return of the military and General Sisi's empowerment, the Egyptian economy hasn't quite recovered to where it was. So it's economically still very vulnerable. Secondly, the military is now basically has got on a horse that's much more reluctant. It's kind of like in a rodeo. It's trying to tame Egypt, and it's going to take a long time. And it's an open question whether you could go back to the Mubarak scenario. I think for U.S. policy, we are where we are. Whether we like the Mubarak's departure, whether we like the military taking back power, the reality is an unstable Egypt is a disaster for us, and it's a disaster for Europe. So, I think it behooves us to, help Egypt stabilize and then, encourage it to move forward in a direction that might be more orderly, inclusion of different groups, and ultimately find a path to a democracy. So, if the Egyptian military, if General Sisi was to fall tomorrow, is not going to be replaced by a stable government. More than likely, Egypt will be a larger version of Libya. And that's not where we want it. So we shouldn't sort of talk in very idealistic terms. Turkey, has moved away from the shining example that it was, 5 years ago as a Muslim democracy that was growing economically at a very rapid clip. Its economy has slowed, much like many other emerging markets. Prime Minister Erdogan's government, obviously is very popular, but now we see him increasingly not as a liberal, popularly elected leader, but as much more of a populist, nationalist leader. Very happy to clamp down on journalists and opponents. It looks sort of as a sort of a Putinization of, I would say, of Turkish domestic scene. I mean, not Putin of today. I mean, Putin of right after Medvedev left office. And then also regionally, I think Turkey was banking very heavily on the Arab world as a place of big investment and influence. And it's lost its influence in the Arab world because they come out the wrong side in Egypt. They came out the wrong side in Syria. And there's no really business opportunity in the Arab world today for Turkey. So I think it's at a critical juncture. So maybe after the parliamentary election, there might be a little bit more direction and stability, and we'll see which way Turkey wants to go.
Thank you. That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council and the Marines Memorial Association, I ask you to join me in first thanking yourselves for the excellent question, and most importantly, thanking Dr. Vali Nasr for this excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.